I'm Jim Richards. I want to welcome you to this week's broadcast where we're talking about anchoring your soul. Now, remember, anchoring your soul is so incredibly important because, as we have learned, the soul is actually the battleground where the war is fought between the flesh and the spirit. And most of what goes on in the soul, as we've talked about previously, is where you experience emotions based on where you're focusing your attention. And so these emotions affect our ability to think clearly, and they affect our ability to make decisions and see them through all the way to the end. So if our soul is not anchored, and again, the concept that you use here, or that the Bible uses, is like a ship that's out on the sea, but it has an anchor. And that anchor, even though may roll and tumble a little bit with the waves, that anchor is going to keep it from drifting away, crashing on the rocks, all those kinds of things. So I want you to understand something. Emotional stability is one of the most important pursuits we should have in our life. You know, when the Bible talks about the Lord being our shepherd, how he leads us in paths of righteousness, and he leads us beside still waters and makes us to lay down in green pastures. But then it says that he restores our soul. Now, there's always a distinction. When you see the word soul, this is not just a synonym for spirit. It's not a synonym for anything. It's talking about the part of man where he experiences emotions that affect his mind, in other words, the way he thinks, and affects his will, his ability to make decisions and see them all the way through until the end. Now, one of the things that sadly has been missing from so much of modern theology is the fact that the nation of Israel and what they went through when they came out of Egypt, when they wandered through the wilderness, and when they went into the land of Canaan, all of that was typology. The Apostle Paul says all of these things were written for our benefit. All of these things were written to show us what we have in God, what we can do in God, how to avoid the mistakes that they made. And so we need to look at the nation of Israel, God's instructions for entering into Canaan, and what he told them to do to ensure that they would never go into captivity. Now, stop and think about this. God gave them a recipe for staying free from captivity, and they should have never fallen. The nation of Israel should have never went into captivity. It should have never been conquered by their enemies. And we can look at this and we can understand those same principles apply to us. And if you dig through the New Testament, you'll see that we have the same warnings that they had. Our problem is we don't use the Bible to interpret the Bible. And so many, many things that are so crucial to us being able to live in victory are really misunderstood, not because they're that complex, but because we don't read the Bible as a whole and see these types and these things that happen to Israel and understand how they come to pass in our lives. And we don't understand how the Apostle Paul comes up with all these teachings that he has. They're all based on everything that happened in the Old Testament. Now, when the land of Canaan, remember this, the land of Canaan does not represent going to heaven after you die. The land of Canaan represents entering into the kingdom of heaven. Now, the kingdom of heaven is a realm where all of the resources of heaven are available to us now here on earth. And the first aspect of living the kingdom of heaven that we have is what goes on in our heart. And really, we can live in peace and joy no matter what's going on around us. And that's the first concept of entering in the kingdom of heaven. Second concept of entering the kingdom of heaven is the fact that Jesus is going to come back and he is going to establish his kingdom here on earth. And we are going to rule and reign with him. So here on earth, then we get to see the kingdom of heaven lived and expressed and ruled the way the earth should have been ruled all this time. And then, of course, the final manifestation of the kingdom of heaven is the fact that New Jerusalem is going to come down to earth, and this is where we're going to spend eternity with God. So So going into Canaan represents living this life of victory, not being enslaved to anything or any foreign enemy or all those kinds of things. Now, when God sent the children of Israel into Canaan, there were seven very brutal nations. Now, there were more than seven nations in Canaan, but there were seven very brutal nations that God told them that they would either have to drive them out of Canaan, or there were a few of them that they would have to totally annihilate. Now, people read that today and they say, oh, man, that God of the Old Testament was bad, bad, bad. No, honestly, those kingdoms that he told them to annihilate, they were ruled by and often populated primarily with the Nephilim. In other words, with the demon possessed, if you will, giants that constantly wreaked havoc on all the other nations in Canaan, but also fought against Israel from the time they came into Canaan until Israel was taken captive and taken out of Canaan. So God told him, he said, listen, there's seven nations there in Canaan, and really, they are the real enemy that you need to conquer. Now, the great world powers at that time, I mean, we're talking about Egypt, we're talking about Babylon, we're talking about Persia, we're talking about Syria, and of course, finally, Rome. And you look at these superpowers and you think, man, that's the real enemy we got to worry about. No, not according to God's wisdom. What you got to worry about is these strongholds that already exist in the land of Canaan. And the real truth is, Israel would have never been dominated by Babylon or Persia or Rome or or Greece or any of these other countries. They would have never been dominated by them if they had done what God said and either eradicated or drove out these seven nations that were there in the land of Canaan. And because they didn't, ultimately, they went into captivity. Now, I want you to understand something. Most powerful nations never fall just because they encounter another nation that has more power than they do. Most powerful nations that fall actually fall because of corruption within that nation. When you look at the Great Wall of China, they went to great expense and great amounts of labor to erect a wall to protect them from invaders. And but eventually it was a dishonest guard on the wall that allowed them to cross over and go to war against the Chinese. Well, that's the way it is all over the world. Right now, what's going on in America is not, the problem is not that we are facing world powers that are greater than we are capable of overthrowing us. The problem is we have become so corrupt and defiled within, and we have so much division and strife within that we actually no longer have the resolve, the unity, or the will to fight against other invaders. I'm telling you, this is what the work of the Antichrist is going to be, or the Antichrist spirit leading up to the revelation of the Antichrist. Create chaos, create division, turn people against one another, weaken from the inside. Why is that the strategy? I'll tell you why. Because the devil cannot conquer you. He has no authority over you. He doesn't have any power that he can use against you other than your own unbelief and fear and your willingness to believe things that are not in harmony with who God is and with the Word of God. So these seven nations, they would really depict the concept of a stronghold or a strong man. Now, when it talks about a strong man, we immediately always kind of think, oh, we're talking about chasing demons. No, the strong man would be the strongest soldier in the army. The stronghold would be the place or the group where people could go and be protected and be able to fight against you. So is a strong man a demon? No, it's actually a military concept. The strong man represents the seat of power. So, I wanted to give this message today the title of Fighting the Wrong Battle, because if you don't fight the strong man and win, you're fighting the wrong battle. You're focusing on people or situations outside of you while your inside is being fragmented with conflicting beliefs and fear and doubt and all of these kinds of things. So you need to understand, until you conquer the strong man, you may celebrate a few victories. And we talked about the triumphal procession in a couple of messages back. And that's the celebration that you have for you win the war. But there were victory parties and victory marches where they won battles, but that was not a triumphal procession. Well, that's the way it is with us. We go from battle to battle to battle to battle, and it's like our life is a never-ending stream of battles that we fight over and over and over again. But if we actually would go after the strong man in our lives, we would actually never have to come back and fight most of these battles ever again. So again, almost every great nation crumbled, not at the hand of a more powerful enemy, but by the betrayal and the compromise that took place internally. Now, God gave Israel a plan for living free and never being conquered. But again, they rationalized why it would be advantageous to do something that made more sense to their leaders. Now, it's kind of interesting because what the children of Israel did, God said, drive these people out, and he gave them a few nations. He said, and you got to eradicate these nations. Man, they are full of demon-possessed Nephilim that will destroy you. They will destroy your families. They will war against you as long as you're in the land. And so Israel, wanting to be like the other nations, instead of driving these people out, they made them slaves. And so it helped the economy of the nation. It gave wealth to people who already had power and had influence. But the problem was, since they didn't drive them out and these people were still living among them, over time, they started accepting these people's cultures, their religious beliefs, their concepts about God. They began to intermarry with the people of Israel. And ultimately, just like God warned them, these people became thorns in their flesh, or thorns in their sides, or thorns in their eyes. And so, when the Bible talks about thorns, like with Apostle Paul, when he talked about how he was given a thorn, people say, oh, that was a demon. No, if you interpret the Bible with the Bible, the thorns always represented a person's involvement with people that they shouldn't be involved with. Having fellowship with people that will lead them away from God. That's one of the things that God warned him of. He said, look, if you don't drive them out, they'll start marrying your sons and your daughters, and they will turn your heart against me. So ironically, they abandoned the only one who could protect them from the superpowers of their day. So again, God told them, in some instances, annihilate. In some instances, drive out these 7 most brutal kingdoms that inhabited the land of Canaan, because they represented the stronghold or the strong man. Now, it's interesting, if you go to Wikipedia or even go to a lot of contemporary Christian writings, almost every source will tell you that these nations represent demons that we should be fighting, thereby ignoring and discounting the victory that Jesus gave us over all principality and power. We don't really need to fight the devil in the traditional sense. How we fight the devil is when we walk in faith. The Bible says, fight a good fight of faith. And one of the things that we understand is that if we are in faith, then we are diametrically opposed to the devil. We are facing him face to face. We're diametrically opposed, and we're more powerful than he is. We don't have to be afraid of him. We don't have to be concerned of what he can do. So, but we abandon, when we give way to our own vain imaginations, we abandon our own mercies, is what the book of Jonah tells us. And Jesus has already defeated all principality and power. We don't have to fight with him, other than to just believe the truth and ignore them and go on with what we're doing. So these nations didn't represent demons. So what did they represent? Well, there were 7 of these powerful nations. And as it turns out, these 7 powerful nations don't represent demons. They represent the lust of the flesh. Now, the Apostle John gives us 7 aspects of the lust of the flesh. He calls it the lust of the eyes, the pride of life, that's 2, and then taste, touch, hear, see, and smell. That's 7. The 7 cravings of the flesh that long to be fulfilled, long to be gratified, that turn into addictions. And this is where the torment for our soul comes from. It's whenever we start craving to satisfy the lust of the flesh and the pride of life, that just gets into ego. But when we start trying to get into wanting to see things we shouldn't see, or we want to touch things we shouldn't touch, or hear things that we shouldn't hear, or smell things that are going to make us crave whatever it is that we're smelling, when we get into those situations, our soul, our emotions become unstable because we have these cravings that are warring against our soul. The Apostle Paul talked about the fact, and I'll never forget the first time I realized this and how clear he was on it, how he talked about the fact that there was a war that was taking place in his members. And you're like, members? What are you talking about? And his members means bodily parts. This is talking about a war that is taking place in our flesh through these cravings and these desires of the flesh. So these wicked idolatrous nations represented the strong man or the stronghold. And because the stronghold, remember, the stronghold is never anything outside of you. The stronghold is always something inside of us that causes us to compromise, that causes us to lose confidence, that causes us to give in, that causes us to yield to these cravings, to this temptation. Matthew 12:29, they were accusing Jesus of doing what he did by the power of the devil. He says something really interesting. He says, how can one enter into a strong man's house and spoil his goods, except he first bind the strong man, and then he will spoil his house? So the key is, and this is a military concept, the key is conquer the strong man. It's just like whenever the Philistines came out and fought against the children of Israel, and suddenly Goliath was a real being. He was a Nephilim. And, there's different accounts to how tall he was. Goliath had 2 brothers who were also Nephilim. And of course, there were many kings who were Nephilim. Og, I think it was one of them. There were several kings in the land that were actually Nephilim. They were demon-driven giants. And so the Philistines came and they squared off against the children of Israel. And they said, you know what, there's no need in all of us dying. So we're going to send out our champion, and you send out your champion, and whoever wins becomes the winner. And so they sent out Goliath. And man, Goliath was huge. He was very easily 9 to 13 feet tall. He was incredibly violent. I tell you, the Nephilim had a reputation for being incredibly wicked and violent. As a matter of fact, most of our stories that we have about vampires and the living dead and all that, almost all that came from actual Nephilim that lived and that did all these wicked things. They drank blood. They were cannibals. I mean, it was horrible. Well, Proverbs 21:22 says this: a wise man scales the city of the mighty and brings down the trusted stronghold. So if they were attacking a town, there was going to be a stronghold that was going to be the basis of their whole operation. It was going to be the most secure place in the city, and they could fight from that place in the city. It might be up in a tower or somewhere, and that was supposed to be their protection. Or in the case of the Philistines, Goliath was the strong man, is the equivalent to a stronghold. And so when David came, he was at peace with God. I mean, he was a lover of God. He was a worshiper of God. He was faithful to God. And David came out, and for David, the whole thing was like, look, you're defying the mighty God here. I'm not putting up with this. And so he takes his sling, picks up a few rocks, and he goes out there and fires that sling off, and bam, hits him in the forehead, kills him. He falls over dead. Hey, David went and cut his head off. By the way, there's a reason for that. David wasn't just trying to be brutal, but one of the things that they ran into during the time of the Nephilim is many times they would kill them and they would regenerate, literally regenerate. And the only way to kill them and make sure they all stayed dead was to cut off their head. Well, and then that came forward in vampire movies and all kinds of monster movies. Now, we learn from this that the stronghold, the thing, the place, and the thing that I'm battling the most are these emotions in my soul that are the product of the lust of the eyes, the lust of the flesh, and the pride of life. And there's always going to be a war going on to gratify those desires. Now, if we don't eradicate the inner enemies, then eventually we will begin to deceive ourselves. And before long, we will find some way to justify fulfilling the lust of the flesh. We'll eventually convince ourselves that it's moral, or that it's all right, or that God doesn't mind, or whatever. But we will eventually give way to unreasonable thinking processes, because that's what happens when your soul gets upset. And then eventually our morality will become a substitute for God's righteousness and our definition of morality and all those kinds of things. So you need to understand, by the way, that is what's going on in our nation today. There's a thing called creating a straw man. What's kind of interesting with creating a straw man, when you create a straw man, this is where you twist what other people say to create an imaginary conflict or an imaginary being that you're fighting against. Let me give you a good example. America has been at war 93% of the time since we were formed as a nation in 1776. One source says 222 out of 239 years since 1776, the U.S. has only been in peace less than 20 years since its birth. So now we got these continuous wars going on. And, there's nothing, when we go to these wars, there's nothing that says we're fighting to free people, that we're fighting, or what we're really fighting for. We don't really even know what we're fighting for. We don't even know what the objectives are. We know that there's corrupt factors involved here. So then suddenly all the politicians and all the people who buy and sell arms and weapons, who get filthy rich off of war, they begin to promote a narrative that says we are fighting for democracy in the world. That's why we are going to all these places, and that's why we're starting all of these wars. Well, if you were to say, I don't think we should be involved in all these wars, then the response would be something like, well, so you don't believe in protecting freedom and spreading democracy. You are an enemy of democracy. Well, you're not an enemy of democracy, and you're not an enemy of freedom. You're just saying, I don't think we should be in all these wars. And when you go back and look at the fact that pretty much over the last 100 years, we've lost most of them. We've lost them horribly. And so we didn't gain anything. We didn't set anybody free. We didn't establish democracy. And so you created a straw man now, and the person who's debating you is not saying you're a person who wants to have peace. They're saying you are a person who hates democracy and doesn't want to spread freedom around the world. I mean, it's crazy. And all of this is stuff we do to ourselves inwardly whenever we are trying to justify giving into these cravings and impulses that are generated in the flesh. And we could go in so many ways to explain this, but there's no sense in going those great details. Here's the key thing. This is where we want to get to. The Apostle Paul says, don't be in fellowship with unbelievers. Now, what is fellowship? Fellowship is more than just hanging out. And really, the book of Proverbs, which is God's wisdom, tells you don't walk with sinners, don't walk in the way of sinners, don't hang around with them, don't do what they do, lest you learn of their ways. Once you get around something that's shocking to you today, eventually it's not shocking anymore. And when it's no longer shocking, then you can take a few steps closer and examine whether or not you want to get in it. And it's just one small step of compromise and self-deception until you find yourself in sin, and you have an addiction. The flesh, anything about the flesh is addictive. Anything you feed the flesh actually affects your nervous system, affects your body in such a way that whatever stimulation you get from anything, whether it's sex, whether it's booze, whether it's drugs, whether it's ego, lying, exaggerating, any pleasure that you get from that, shortly you have to have more of it to get that same kind of pleasure. And so then once we've given in and we're comfortable giving in, then we have to lie to ourselves with bigger lies. We have to do more bizarre things. We have to push farther. We have to get closer to sin. We have to find other kinds of sins to get into. And eventually we are unequally yoked with unbelievers who are influencing the way that we think. Now, I'm not saying don't be the friend of sinners. Jesus was a friend of sinners, but I'm telling you what, I've heard too many preachers over the last 10 years talk about the love of God, talk about how we needed to be the friend of sinners, but they don't properly define what that means. That doesn't mean that these are people we get input from. They don't mean that there are people who get to influence our life. So listen, overcome the strongman. Deal with what's inside you. Go back and listen to this whole series. It is available on our website for free, and you can dive into it, or order the audio series and dive a little bit deeper. 6 hours of exercises, teaching, and things that you can do to win and bind up strongman and overcome all of these issues that are warring against you. All right, I hope you've enjoyed this so much. I got one more great message in this series before we'll go to a brand new series. I'm so looking forward to it. Let me encourage you, if you want to help us change the way the world sees God, take this message of grace, peace, faith, righteousness, and the love of God to the ends of the earth, go to my website, impactministries.com, and check out Becoming a World Changer and help us financially reach the world.